Sochology Edu series. My name is Mudassir Bangish. We have a very special guest for you today. But before we get started, just some quick announcements and housekeeping. So, Soch Cafe Islamabad is happening next week, Friday, on the 6th of October. Soch Cafes are in person product manager meetups where PMs connect, discuss a topic, exchange ideas and experiences, and it's also a fantastic networking opportunity. So, visit our LinkedIn page, look for the Soch Cafe Islamabad post, and register in order to attend. And if you haven't already, start following Product Soch on LinkedIn so you can know where and when the next ones are scheduled in your city, as well as be updated on our other event streams. For this session, whether you're joining us from LinkedIn or YouTube, please post your questions into the chat and we'll bring them up towards the end of the session. Our guest today is Ravi Mehta. Ravi is the co founder and CEO of Outpace, a company that is reinventing the way that people learn and grow. Over his career, Ravi has scaled well known products that have impacted millions of people and scaled teams to meet the challenge. Previously, he was Chief Product Officer at Tinder, Product Director at Facebook, VP of Consumer Product at TripAdvisor, and Executive in Residence at Reforge. He is an active investor and advisor, primarily focused on consumer tech companies. We're super grateful that he's taken out the time to join us today to talk about the three pillars of product decision making. So, making great products is the outcome of making great decisions, right? As product builders, we base decisions on three pillars: intuition, analytics, and customer feedback. The best decisions are made when we draw from all three pillars, but striking a consistent balance is difficult. People, teams, and companies tend to bias towards one type of decision making. In this session, Ravi will walk through examples from across the industry to illustrate the three pillars of product decision making and why it's so hard to get it right all the time. Ravi, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be with this community. I have been a product leader through my entire career, and I've spent the last couple of years really trying to pay it forward and help product communities throughout the industry really level up. And so I'm excited to be here. As you have questions, feel free to jump in. It's best if this is a conversation, and there's some interesting topics here. I'll go through some interesting cases. So feel free to jump in with questions. So with that, I want to get started with just an insight that I've had from my product career. It makes a lot of sense, but in the heat of building products, it can be hard to remember. And that is that great products are the result of great decisions. And the best decisions deliver value, not just for the business, but also for customers. And if we zoom out and we ask the question, what are the inputs to really good product decisions? I think it really comes down to just three things. There's intuition, so there's a sense of what will make for a great product experience. There's analytics, there's what's the data telling us, and there's research. It's what we're learning from our conversations with customers. And each one of these is incredibly important to making a strong product decision. But what typically happens both for individuals and for companies is that we tend to gravitate towards one mode of decision making that's the most comfortable for us. And so one of the things that's been really popular in the last 5 or 7 years, especially as companies have acquired very big databases, is very much relying on analytics, relying on an experimental mode of product development and really treating product like a science. And that can work incredibly well. But when it's not coupled with good intuition and good understanding, empathetic understanding of customers, it can lead product teams astray. And so as we think about making product decisions, it's really important that we focus on how to strike a balance between these three inputs and be on guard for, are we over relying on one of these inputs or another? And so as we walk through this conversation, I want to take a closer look at each one of these different inputs, what it looks like when it goes really well, and what are some cases where it might have gone wrong. So let's start with intuition. So what is product intuition? And sometimes this is called product sense. Intuition is ultimately a sensibility about what a great product looks like for the customer. And the amazing thing about intuition is at its best, it leads to breakthrough products that disrupt markets. It leads to 10x opportunities. And so intuition can be incredibly powerful. And so let's look at an example of that. One of the companies that's best known for making really intuition-driven decisions is Apple. Apple has a history of really understanding what customers want and boiling that down into products that meet that need. And so there's an interesting case here. Shortly after rejoining Apple, Steve Jobs began dreaming really big about Apple, not just as a computing company, but really as a consumer company. And so his question was, what is the next great product for Apple? Steve had always been a lover of music. At the time that he joined Apple, there was a burgeoning MP3 player market where MP3 players were starting to replace Discman and Walkman. And he looked at the state of the market and he said, there's all these devices that are ugly and unintuitive. And he felt that Apple could do better. And that's when he started to think about what can Apple do in this market that is radically different and radically better. And that led to the iPod, which was a radically simpler MP3 player. And although it was simpler, it wasn't a simple device. Apple really had to use all of its hardware savvy at the time to create something that was small enough to fit in a pocket, that had more capacity, that had longer battery life. And the iPod was ultimately the device that led to a strategic sequence that has resulted in the Apple that we know today. So in 2002, when Apple released the iPod, the company was valued at $10 billion. Today, it's grown over 250 times. It's a $2.5 billion plus company. What was interesting about this is that when Apple released the iPod, it was met with just a raft of controversy and skepticism. And this is often true of good intuition. Good intuition flies in the face of prevailing wisdom. People said things like, all that hype for an MP3 player, breakthrough digital device. Steve Jobs, people who were skeptical of him often said he surrounded himself in a reality distortion field. And a leading columnist at the time said, the reality distortion field is starting to warp Steve's mind if he thinks for 1 second that this thing is going to take off. And
Yeah.
skepticism in the face of intuition is actually a positive signal. Peter Thiel refers to this as knowing a secret. He believes you can make groundbreaking companies when the founder has an intuition about something that the rest of the world hasn't discovered yet.
Yeah,
And so let's
Ravi. Yeah,
what was
sorry, I just wanted to
happening.
chime in. Like a good
Yeah,
current example is Tesla, right? I mean, just even
yeah.
if you look back like 5, 7 years ago, people were making fun of Tesla just like they were making fun of Apple, right? And they've really moved the industry.
And it's absolutely the case that when you look at things that are really game changing, I have an example from Airbnb later in the presentation. It seems crazy at the outset, but it's often due to a founder being really close to customers and having an intuition that they feel in their gut is right and that the rest of the world hasn't quite figured out yet. And yeah, that's a great example. So let's look a little bit at like what was Apple's intuition about this. And so intuition is not something that is completely gut. It comes out of nowhere. Ultimately, Apple's intuition was grounded in very good strategy and a smart analysis of a big market. But one of the key intuitions was that Steve Jobs felt like if you could put 1,000 songs rather than 10 songs in a person's pocket, that would change people's relationship to music. It would change how people think about this, not as a device that they carry with them every once in a while, and they need to carry CDs and other things with them, but that it would actually be a constant companion, and that this would lead to a new era of companion-based computing, which is absolutely the strategy that's played out with the iPhone and the Apple Watch and where they're going now with Vision Pro. He also believed that people would pay a premium for devices that play such an important part in their lives. And so this has also been, a critical part of Apple's strategy. And then he believed that iPod would be a beachhead to a much larger market, and that ultimately this would lead to Apple growing from a computer company to really a lifestyle brand. And so in this case, Apple's intuition proved to be really correct. The challenge is that intuition also can be destructive if intuition isn't grounded in that same sort of strategic thinking, research, and analytics. Yeah, I think a really good example in this case is Snapchat. So in 2017, Snapchat decided to release a redesign of the product. And the idea behind the redesign was an intuition that Evan Spiegel had about how social interactions with a person's close friends and media interactions were different and needed to be presented as separate experiences within the product. Evan had been incredibly successful and has continued to be really successful by having a very strong intuition of young what young users want. But in this case, there was an intuitive insight that wasn't grounded in what people's day to day usage of the product was. And what happened was over the course of about 12 months, Snapchat's stock after the redesign dropped by 40%. And the challenge here wasn't so much that Snap released something that didn't work. We all do that. That's part of learning what people want. The problem was that Snap was slow to react to that feedback. The company felt like its intuitive insight was the right one and really stuck to that design, even when it was clear that there was a backlash. And there was a backlash both in terms of user engagement and also in terms of some of the most popular users. In February 2018, Kylie Jenner tweeted, "So does anyone else not open Snapchat anymore?" Which sort of typified a lot of the feeling that people had about the redesign. And this is interesting because Snap redesigned the product and they saw that there was a backlash. And that was something that was a negative for the company. And in a couple moments, I'll go through a Facebook example where Facebook went through a similar thing. They redesigned the product, initially saw a backlash, but had a very different outcome. And so I'll talk about the importance of data in terms of that. And so ultimately, Snapchat's redesign did have a negative impact on the company, but they were able to say, over a period of time, let's roll it back and then get back to growth. And so the lesson here is that intuitive decision making can lead through breakthrough insights, but it's also hard to evaluate. And if you don't pair intuitive decisions with really strong analytics and a really good ear to listening to customers, then it can result in swinging and missing a lot. And so that brings us to our next pillar of product decision making, which is analytics. So analytical decisions are based on the insights, not just the data generated as customers use the product. At its best, analytical decision making enables products and companies to reach their maximum potential. So analytics is incredibly helpful for once we figure out something that's really working in the market, to figuring out how to optimize that so that it can reach its full potential.
Yeah.
And so there's an interesting example from Facebook that is similar to the Snap example, but had a very different outcome. Early in Facebook's history, one of the things that they saw through their analytics was that people would come to the product, and just to rewind because this was a while ago. So Facebook, before it had the news feed, was very similar to how MySpace worked, where you would have a collection of profiles, and so everyone on the platform could have a profile. And what Facebook saw is that when people logged into the platform, what they typically did was they would go from profile to profile for all their close friends, and they would essentially mine for updates. And so Facebook felt like they could productize this use case by building a new homepage that wasn't profile based, but that was actually feed based, so that in one place you could see all of the updates from all of the people within your social network. And so both intuitively and analytically, Facebook felt like they had a really big win on their hands. But when they released the newsfeed, they were in for a really big surprise. Ruchi Sangvi, the product manager for Newsfeed, said, we woke up to hundreds of thousands of outraged people. Facebook groups like I Hate Newsfeed and Ruchi is the Devil had formed in the middle of the night. News reports and students were camped out in front of their offices. We had to sneak out the back door to leave the office. So I think as product managers, we've all had features that we've launched that didn't work, but probably have not had our users camping outside our office. So this was one of the fastest and most viral backlashes in product history. But what Facebook did next was really interesting. So Ruchi goes on to say, amidst all the chaos, all the outrage, we noticed something unusual. Even though everyone claimed they hated it, engagement had doubled. And so rather than immediately deciding that the newsfeed wasn't working and that this backlash meant that they should pull back from the feature, their instinct was to dive into the analytics. And so let's look at what that meant for Facebook. And so, firstly, it meant that they were thinking about this feature analytically from the very earliest phases. The conceptualization of the feedback or the feature was based on analytics, and then the monitoring and observation of how the product was going was based on analytics. And that's really true of Facebook today as well. Their true north is analytics. They judge the success of major features like the newsfeed based on engagement impact and not necessarily based on more qualitative measures. In addition, they were looking at data in real time and were able to quickly move on it. So Snap waited months to respond to the backlash. Mark Zuckerberg actually posted about the newsfeed controversy later that day to quell concerns. And what they were able to do was they were able to say, we understand that there's a backlash here, but we're also noticing that people are using the newsfeed and it's helping them get to the information that they want. And as a result, they were able to quickly address some of the biggest concerns and really optimize the feature. And even today, the newsfeed is a core part of the Facebook experience. And Facebook has used this analytical approach for many of the company's big bets over time, including the shift to mobile, breaking Messenger out, adding video, adding Marketplace. All of these things were grounded in an analytical understanding of what users are doing on the platform.
Yeah, just to Ravi, throw in another Tesla example there, right? I
Yeah.
know when like the rear-wheel drive only Model 3 came out, huge backlash. What do you mean only 200 something miles of range? Nobody's going to use this, right? But they had gone through the data and figured out that okay, you
Yep.
know what, like for 90+% of journeys, right? People are only going a couple of miles or commuting in a day. They'll come back and they'll recharge. And you talked about that vocal minority, right? It's usually the press that just has a field day on these sorts of things, and they pick up on one or two comments here and there, but they kind of stuck through it, and now it's like their best-selling vehicle.
Absolutely. It's such a great example. And this is a great example of all three of these pillars of decision making coming together, looking at the analytics of what people are doing, talking to customers about how they're using their vehicles, and then having the intuition to say, we can create a new category here at a cheaper price point. Yeah, it's such a good example. And if you only relied on one source of data in that case, you might actually end up with the wrong decision. You might say, yeah, we don't need this, or the range might have been too low if they hadn't have looked at the data. So similar to intuition, analytics can help products reach their maximum potential, but they can also lead to incremental thinking where everything is viewed through how do we, what's the experiment we can run and how do we optimize. And so I think a really interesting example of this is HomeAway. HomeAway is a company that innovated a lot around the vacation rentals space. Their real superpower that they created in the organization was a scientific mindset. And they used that scientific mindset to very consistently understand the key metrics of their business, one of which was the number of bookable listings on their platform. And they used that scientific mindset to optimize that over time. And so if you look at the number of bookable listings on HomeAway, over the course of multiple years, they achieved really impressive and consistent 25 to 30% growth. In 2015, they were purchased by Expedia for about $4 billion. And so this was a really good example of a company that knew its North Star metrics and was able to move them in a very consistent and scientific way. The problem is that the strongest incremental execution isn't enough to fend off disruptive competitors. And so Airbnb came into the space not just with a scientific mindset, but a really deep and empathetical understanding of customers. And so they reframed vacation rentals not just as a transaction between a property owner and a property renter, but really as a human transaction between a host and a guest. And that was a fundamental pivot on the market that opened up vacation rentals, not just to the people who were vacation rental customers at that time, but people who wanted to stay in a wide variety of accommodations and wanted to live like a local while they were on vacation. And so this enabled Airbnb to not only keep pace with HomeAway, but really outpace HomeAway in terms of their ability to add listings and expand the market. And today, Airbnb is worth 6 times more than Expedia, which is the owner of HomeAway. And that includes all of Expedia's businesses, flights, hotels, everything else. And it's probably close to 30 times the value of HomeAway when it was initially acquired. And so this is a really good example of how analytical thinking alone is often not enough. And so that brings us to our last pillar of product decision making, and that's feedback from customers. And this is something that Airbnb really excels at. So feedback-based decisions are based on qualitative and quantitative research of existing and potential customers. At its best, feedback-based decision-making fosters empathy and uncovers the real heart of what customers want and what they need from their products in order to love those products. I think as an industry, as a technology industry, we're used to thinking about things in a scientific, very data-driven way. And in some cases, over relying on data and not relying enough on the fact that our products are being used by people, by humans, and human behavior is necessarily hard to quantify. And I love this quote by Albert Einstein. He says, "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts." And this is a really good reminder that metrics will only go so far in terms of the products that we're building. And Airbnb is one of the best examples of a company that's able to bring together both the scientific mindset and a really deep empathy for customers. One of the quotes I love from Brian Chesky is, "If you're only doing A/B tests, you are not designing with empathy. We didn't just meet our users, we lived with them." And so in this, he's talking about the fact that today, of course, experimentation is important for optimizing products. But if you over experiment on your customers, you're kind of treating them like bacteria in a petri dish, poking and prodding and seeing what works and doesn't work. And ultimately, in order to create significant value for customers, it's important to empathize with them. And in the Airbnb case, in the early days, and I think still to this day, Brian does this. He didn't just like interview users and do focus groups. He actually, lived with people, stayed with people, had people stay with him, giving him a very human understanding of the experience that his product drives. Yeah. And one of the really interesting frameworks that Airbnb uses to answer the question of how do we create a product that people really love is not to ask, what does the 5-star experience look like, but really ask the question of what does the 11-star experience look like? If we think about a scale of 1 star to 11 stars, on one side, we have experiences that are repulsive, that I would never want to use again. And then on the other side, we have experiences that are absolutely magical, that are things that become a memory that is just, so clear, so vivid in a person's mind. And so if we think about this in terms of, the Airbnb check-in experience, if a 1-star experience might be you arrive at a vacation rental, you arrive at a property, the host is a no-show, you're left on the street. Yeah. The 5-star experience is, similar to what the hotel experience would be. You get to the property, there's someone waiting for you, they let you in as soon as you arrive, and everything works great. But from there, we can actually take the experience even further and make it more magical. And so the 7-star experience in this case would be the host lets you in, shows you a fully stocked kitchen, and gives you the keys to his car. So in this case, it's probably not going to happen. The host is probably not going to have a car that you can use, but maybe that's something to think about is, what are the things that Airbnb can solve for in terms of transportation and snacks and just making a person's experience feel really home-like. And then the 11-star experience is the same welcome as the Beatles in 1964. So 5,000 screaming fans meeting you as you get off the plane. Of course, it's impossible, but it's absolutely magical. And it frees up us as product builders to think about how do we create those experiences for people. And one of the really interesting examples, and this is from Brian Chesky's interview with Reid Hoffman on. I'm blanking on the name of the podcast. I'll follow up after with the name of the podcast. But just look for Brian Chesky and Reid Hoffman in your podcasting app, and in that he talks about having the approach that they used for understanding how to create a better trip experience for customers. And so they did two things. They started and they followed a traveler on a trip to San Francisco without any intervention. And they saw, what did he do during the trip? And so he landed at the airport. He had to hail a cab. He stayed in a kind of nondescript budget hotel. He ate at sort of a nondescript restaurant. At the end of the evening, he was kind of sitting alone at a bar. He did a trip to Alcatraz. And so he did all of the things that a person might do when they travel to San Francisco. And it was a good trip. The person enjoyed it, but it wasn't magical. And so for the next step, he actually worked with Hollywood writers to storyboard an experience that would feel like a magical trip. And so the elements of that were a private limo picked up Ricardo from the airport, took him to a top-rated, absolutely beautiful Airbnb. They had reservations at one of San Francisco's top restaurants. He went to a private cocktail party with locals from San Francisco at the end of the evening. And at the very end of the evening, did a midnight mystery bike tour. And so this contrast, like, what is an absolutely magical trip from what is the trip that people normally take? They made Ricardo the hero in this story, and it was an absolutely moving experience for him as a traveler, and it helped Airbnb understand what is that delta between good versus magical, and how can we build that into the product. And so similarly, feedback is really essential to understanding and empathizing customers, but you have to use feedback with judgment. You can't just do what customers ask and expect that you'll be able to create value for them. And a really interesting example of this is OkCupid. So a few years ago, the dating product, the product managers at the dating product were trying to understand how do they improve the experience for their customers. And talking to customers is hard. This is one of the reasons that as product builders, we don't do it more often. And so what they did was they would often rely on Reddit. And they would go to Reddit and ask people, what do you want from the product? The challenge was that the customers that were on Reddit that were most vocal about the product were actually a minority of people that were power users. And so those users kept saying, we want more messages. We want to meet more people. We want to be engaged with more people. And this actually correlated with the analytics as well. What OkCupid saw was that as people got more messages on the dating app, it actually increased their retention. And so they did everything possible to make sure that from the moment you started to use the app, you got as many messages as possible. But what they misunderstood is that, that was a minority of users. And that if they looked at the majority of first-time users that were just using the product, those users would often get overwhelmed by too many messages on that first day. And as a result, they wouldn't want to come back the next day. And so even though customers were asking for more messages and analytics said that they needed more messages, if you talk to the average user, you were able to see that actually this was not the optimal experience. And so OkCupid optimized their experience by pulling back on the number of new messages that new users would get. And as a result, created a much better onboarding experience. So with that, I just want to recap. We have these three pillars of decision-making: intuition, analytics, and feedback. Done well, each of these can have a really significant impact, but done poorly, there are some downsides to each of these different ways of making decisions. Intuition can lead to valuable insights that have a disruptive impact, but it can also lead to misguided investments and big misses. Analytics can enable products to reach their maximum potential through experimentation and optimization, but it can also result in incrementality, diminishing returns, and even eventual irrelevance. There's lots of cases of companies that are highly analytical that get disrupted by startups who are much closer to customers and understand their needs at a more fundamental level. And finally, customer feedback can lead to deep and accurate understanding of customer needs, but it can sometimes focus on the vocal minority and miss the opportunities that customers can't see or can't articulate themselves. And one of the incredibly important things about this is when you pull on each of these different pillars of decision making, they actually reinforce each other. So, good intuition helps you synthesize the analytical insights that you're getting and helps you really understand the feedback that you're getting. Good analytical insights help you support your intuitive conclusions and helps you validate the research findings that you're having from talking to customers at a more significant scale. And then good research improves your intuition of what customers want and deepens the understanding that you have of what you're seeing within the analytics and the data. So ultimately, I encourage everyone to think about these three pillars as you're making product decisions. And if you pull on each of these different inputs, you'll be able to make better product decisions that help you find product market fit, that help you grow successful products, and help you find and expand your product and innovate in ways that seem difficult but become much easier when you pull from all these three sources of decisions. So I know we're a little bit over time, so with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, awesome. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Ravi. And
Yeah, absolutely.
the Airbnb example, just something that kind of got me thinking. Typically, when you check into a hotel for a vacation, you're looking for an experience outside that hotel, right? But Airbnb actually, provides you that plus an experience within your stay, right? And so I think that was just such a brilliant move. We've got a couple of questions as well. I'll just bring them up. So, hey, Ravi, on that quote by Einstein, which is brilliant, how do you identify early signs of an effective, ineffective product data strategy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the first question is to ask when you have an analytical insight, does this make sense? So, just in terms of common sense, does this seem like it's pointing in the right direction? And so, especially companies that are running a lot of A/B tests, they typically get into the mode of if an A/B test is, if A is better than B, then we'll go with A regardless. And two
Mm.
things are really important there. One is you're using confidence intervals with which to judge A versus B. Oftentimes, it's a 95% confidence interval. And that means that one out of every 20 experiments that you run are wrong. So you can't just blindly go and use the experiments. And number two, if you have an experimental finding that just doesn't, that defies common sense, then it probably means that, there was noise in the data, or it probably means that there's something that is unseen. And I think a really good example is if you have a beautifully designed product and you add a big red flashing button to that product, guess what? People are going to click on it. And you're going to see that your click-through rates on that button go up. But people are probably clicking on it because they actually don't know what the button does and they want to figure it out. And it seems like it's important. And so what you might find is that your conversion deeper in the funnel is actually lower than it was before because people are clicking because they're confused, not because they're really clear about what the next step is. And so I think those are, that's really one of the early signs of thinking about sort of ineffective product data strategy is when you start to make decisions with data that don't feel right, aren't supported by intuition, aren't supported by your conversations with customers. That likely means that there's something that the data is telling you that is not quite accurate in terms of what customers want.
That's a fantastic insight, Ravi, right? I think when most people think of A/B testing, they think of just like a small piece within that feature set. And unfortunately, sometimes we lose sight of the entire customer journey. So that's a great point that you brought up that we should be aware of that. All right, we have another question as well from Hassan. So, how do you prioritize balance when user value and business value conflict? Are they mutually exclusive?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Hassan. I think business value and user value can diverge for a period of time, but they can never diverge for all time, right? At some point, if a company optimizes only for themselves and not for their customers, they are making themselves prone to disruption. And there's lots of examples of companies doing this where they over monetize their users. I get this feeling all the time as I'm browsing around the web. There's just so many calls to action. There's so many advertisements. A lot of media properties are just they're pushing so much at me that it's actually hard to read their content, and so I don't even bother anymore. And so this is an example of where a company has over monetized and ultimately, is likely to get disrupted by companies that offer cleaner reading experiences, whether it's Substack or Medium or some of the social networks. And so it's absolutely the case that as product builders, every once in a while, we need to optimize for the company when the user value isn't necessarily clear. We might need to hit a revenue goal or a profit goal or something like that. It's important to do that knowingly and to say, hey, we're making the decision now. We know that there's a gap between what we're doing and what customers really want, but it's the right thing for the business. Let's understand that we're creating product debt in making that decision that we're eventually going to have to pay back. And so having that balance of short term and long term is really important. And I think where companies sort of get off the rails is they start to ignore the customer altogether, or they start to get into a wishful thinking mode where they hope that all the things that they're doing to increase ad load on the site or make the site, really intrusive in terms of trying to get the person's email address or that sort of things. They sort of convince themselves that that's what customers want in a wishful thinking way. So, I just to kind of summarize, ask yourself, if there is a delta, be really conscious of it, make the right decision for the business at the time, but understand that that's creating debt that you'll likely have to pay back.
Awesome. So Ravi, I'm wondering if you have time for one more question and then we can
Yeah,
close it out.
absolutely.
Okay, awesome. I think this is a good one. So I wonder if tech debt or product debt, poor product decisions in the past impact the balance of these three pillars and drawing biases. So it's a thought. Like, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I haven't thought about it in this particular way, but I think it probably does. Um, what I've seen is that companies that are comfortable with a certain way of decision making sort of gravitate towards it, and then it becomes just part of the cultural wisdom about how to make decisions, and it goes deeper and deeper towards imbalanced decision making rather than balanced decision making. Um, and so, yeah, this is a really interesting question. I think it does draw in the biases, and I think that's one of the reasons that companies have tech debt or product debt that gets out of control, is because they're sort of looking at things one way, and not zooming out and asking and questioning assumptions of, are we making decisions in the right way? Should we be focused on other things? And what tends to happen is those companies will continue to operate in that way. They may start to find that churn goes higher. They may start to find that revenue saturates. And then we're in such an active market with lots of startups that in that same space, people see that the old adage that Jeff Bezos likes to say is, your margin is my opportunity. People see a business doing really well that's not executing as well as possible, and then come in with a product that streamlines. I was just on a Reforged podcast called Unsolicited Feedback, and we talked about Jira. Jira is a product today that, it's incredibly powerful, but it doesn't always work well, especially for smaller customers. And Linear, a recent upstart, has been able to come in with a much more streamlined product and get some really interesting traction. And so there's an example of, I think Jira has some debt in terms of product complexity that can get in the way of certain use cases. And Linear saw that and has come in and really taken advantage of that opportunity.
Awesome. Okay, so unfortunately, we are out of time. This was amazing. So amazing session, Ravi. Thank you so much. On behalf of myself and the product community, I know we learned a ton. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for joining us. We hope you have a great day.
Thank you, Mudasir, for having me. Thank you, everyone. Really enjoyed the session today.